Hello, welcome to the video series for Geography 701 at West Virginia University, Quantitative Spatial Analysis. As I said in the in-class session, the first few videos will look at the structure of an academic paper that we might see in quantitative analysis. I recognize that this is one perspective on the way an article is structured. Probably most articles have this general structure, but opinions may vary. Sometimes things can be different, so you won't be able to say shoehorn every single paper that you find, even in this course, into this format. But it is I think a good means of thinking about and organizing your thoughts and how you're going to present what you are doing and what you have done. I tend to think of this in almost kind of like building a court case. You want to convince people, you want to convince the audience that this is important new knowledge. So with that mentality in mind, we can now look at kind of the different sections of a paper. These will, you'll obviously notice, correspond to the different milestones that affect the paper in the class. So I have this set up with 7 different sections. The paper milestones merge a couple of these, and that's okay. You will sometimes see them merged in regular journal articles too, sometimes not. It depends on how long the article is. The first one is the introduction. You're always going to start with that. And with this idea in mind of we are building a case to convince people this is important and new knowledge, the intro is basically setting out that groundwork. That the point of the introduction is to say, here is an important problem, and we don't really have a complete answer to it. It could be a setup where we don't know about one particular aspect of this problem, and it could be a spatial aspect. To borrow from a manuscript I have recently submitted, a problem with trying to measure the socioeconomic barriers to access to healthcare is that there's a wide range of ways people have measured those barriers. And we don't really know what's best. We don't really know even how much they agree with each other. So that is setting out the problem. The next stage is the lit review. the lit review, as the name suggests, a review of the literature, it goes and it explains what has been done already with respect to that problem. And what you are doing here is, in a sense, the purpose is twofold. And we'll see this when we get into the video that is in more depth on the lit review itself. A twofold purpose of A, you want to convince the reader that this is indeed unresolved, that it hasn't been done, but almost always there's similar work. There's been work that approaches that, even if it doesn't quite get all the way to the solution you're after. So it's to lay that groundwork of what people have done before. Another approach can be setting up, there's disagreement about this issue, and you have something new to add to that argument, to that topic. So again, to return to that manuscript that I have submitted and it's under review, is, okay, what's been done about the problem? Well, part of what I did was to say, here are a series of different ways people have measured those socioeconomic barriers to accessing healthcare. This study measured it with a lot of income-based variables. This one included rurality, and recognizing that rural communities often face additional barriers to getting healthcare. Somebody else looked at language barriers, and so on and so forth. So different ways people have looked at measuring the socioeconomic barriers to accessing healthcare. I also, in the lit review, and this then will eventually tie into methods, I also said, okay, here are similar problems to say, where there can be a different choice of metrics for measuring something. How did they go and assess the extent to which those agreed with each other? And I cited those, even though they weren't about accessing healthcare. It was to say there's many measures for spatial weights matrices in that case, and to say one way of studying this is to look at how they approached the extent to which those agreed. I can take that approach and use it here to study something different. Likewise, in kind of a physical geography setting, you might also say, okay, I want to be doing something to study the movements of deer. Oh, okay, maybe the movements of deer haven't been studied, but the movements of another ungulate, like elk, have been studied. Well, the ways of studying the movements of elk can also possibly apply to the study of deer. And to build that case of, here is an unresolved problem, here are ways people have either addressed that problem or addressed similar problems. That's information I can bring to bear with this particular problem. The goal here is ultimately to reinforce that case that you made in the introduction, that this problem is both important and unresolved. Once you have established that, we can then move on to the data section. So I'm putting that as, how will the problem be measured? So with the data section, in many ways it's very much a nuts and bolts section to write. That you say, okay, I am studying access to healthcare. I saw that all of these different variables have been used in the past. So to assess those, I calculate as closely as possible, given available data, a dozen or more of these different indices. And I then say, I got the data from the American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau, accessed through what used to be called FactFinder. And so the data section, and the other part of the data section is about the study area. To say, my study area is the state of West Virginia. Here's some important and relevant information about the state of West Virginia. It is predominantly rural. So the measures that work best for West Virginia may not work well for New York City. Marking out, here's where primary care sites may be found, and some of the different aspects of West Virginia, like the mountainous terrain, that itself can be a barrier to accessing different facilities. So to set out the different characteristics of West Virginia that are relevant for the study area, as well as to say, I got the data about West Virginia from this source. That source then, as the American Community Survey from the US Census Bureau, gets cited, as any journal article would be cited in the study. The other thing there is, if it is not obvious, the choice of variables must be defended within the data section. So to say, okay, such and such study that took place in China used a particular variable. Well, the Census Bureau doesn't have that variable, but they have something similar, so here's what I used. Or a study in a coastal area used distance from the coast as part of its measurement. West Virginia, being inland, doesn't have any coast, therefore that variable does not get included. So if you're in a position to be making choices about the data, what you include, what you exclude, both in terms of the attributes, as well as removing any outlier observations, those choices get defended in the data section. Once you have your data section established and you figure out what data you are bringing to bear to study the problem, how you are measuring that problem, we then have to be clear on how we are evaluating that problem. So really, whether it is a quantitative study or a qualitative study, there is going to be a method section that says, here is what I did to analyze my data. In quantitative spatial analysis, that typically takes the form of justifying and describing, actually you describe first, then you justify, so describing and justifying the choice of statistical techniques that you use to analyze your data. Just as in the data, you had to defend your choices of, I included this variable, I excluded that variable, I removed this observation because it is such an outlier, it's not representative, it's not going to help me understand the problem in general. The choice of methods has to be defended to make sure it really, truly addresses the problem at hand. And with that, I will introduce one more thing. You may have seen it for those of you in geography, you may have seen this in the traditions course. The idea of a very clearly defined research question. that more often than not comes at the end of the introduction, where you go and you say, I am setting out very precisely one or more research questions. So I can say, okay, again, to take the example that I have, my research question is, to what extent do different measures of socioeconomic barriers to healthcare, to what extent do those different measures agree with each other or disagree with each other? As a secondary question, which is somewhat more on the discussion and follow on, how much does this affect, could this affect state policies? Because the whole point of this isn't just some academic exercise. And it gets to part of the intro there. And why is this important? Well, it's important because if a state is designating money for a policy on addressing those barriers to healthcare, they need to make sure they are using the correct measure. They need to make sure their index or measurement of those socioeconomic barriers is the right one to use. Otherwise, they are wasting money. And if they disagree, if those different indices disagree about which parts of the state have the greatest need, it is important to know that so that you can choose the right policy, basically. The data and the methods you have to make very clear that your data are measured in such a way that it gives you good information about your research question. Likewise, you have to justify your choice of methods with respect to the research question to make it clear that your methods will help you answer that research question. Once you have set out your methods and how will I analyze my problem? How will I analyze my research question? We then move into the results section. And it says, what are the results of that evaluation? It could be a table, it could be maps, it could be the kind of the number of outcomes of statistical analyses. Whether that's p-value or you're using a different framework. We'll be mainly seeing p-values in this course probably. Depends on, as we said on the first class, on what people pick for the exact techniques. But no matter what technique or techniques you use to answer your question, or research question or questions, what are the results? This is very much just the facts. Here are the results. You may potentially draw out important components of that if it's not obvious. But you're not interpreting those results yet. You are simply saying, here are the results. Here is what happened when I did my methods. That interpretation comes in through the discussion. So you might then say, okay, here is the outcome of my regression analysis, for example. The regression table is in the results section, but the discussion is where you say, okay, I found this variable to be strongly correlated with my independent variable. What this means is, okay, here are, so I found I'll take my example to say what's important, what's useful in those results. I found that there is, by and large, general agreement about the extent to which the different indices are correlated with each other, as I found through a correlation matrix. I also took a dendrogram, which is assessing groups of indices. So the indices of these 4 papers were all pretty similar to each other. They highlighted rurality. But these 3 papers did not do that, and they identified a different part of the state as more at risk of having those barriers to accessing healthcare. In the results section, I gave the maps of those indices. In the discussion section, I then say, because is where I give the interpretation, because these indices have a explicit rurality component through either a rural-urban code or through population density or both, they directly identify rural communities as being more at risk of not being able to get health care that they need. That's one group. Another group did not do that. They had more economic factors of poverty rate, of unemployment, of the percent of people without health insurance. That identified what in West Virginia is the southern coalfields, which is the most economically distressed part of the state. So in the discussion, I highlight those differences and why they arise based upon how the different indices were constructed. So the conclusion, in a way, to return to the idea of we are building up this argument that my paper is presenting important and unresolved information about a problem. That my conclusion is the so what. Why should you care? Why should I care as the reader about what you have just told me? Assuming I have done a good job in the introduction, setting out the importance of the problem, I can then, in my conclusion, say, okay, hopefully you answered it. My research question was answered. The results, the discussion, they provide and they interpret that answer to the research question. The conclusion drives home that argument as to why it matters. Why is it important that, okay, now I can pull upon the examples and say, if a policy-making body, whether it's the state legislature, whether it is the State Department of Health and Human Services, or other agencies, if they are developing policies to improve people's access to health care, they would need to be aware that these different measurements of access to healthcare actually give different perspectives, different impressions. If they pick one of the indices that highlights rurality, that's going to tell them that there are really severe barriers in the southeastern part of the state, which is the most rural, the most sparsely populated part of West Virginia. However, if they are looking at economic factors, then instead that's going to tell them they need to spend their limited resources in the southwestern part of the state, which is the most economically distressed. And they probably only have enough money to do the southeast or the southwest. It's important to know that these disagree so that they can make the best decision possible, given especially what they know, given their other information about the state and about the state's healthcare system. So that is an example of why is this important? Why should you care what I have just done? It is also common, not guaranteed, but common that future work shows up in the conclusion. To say, what are the next steps? What will I do next to better understand this problem? To better resolve the situation? Because most of the time, even though I'm setting up here, here's an important and unresolved problem. You're probably not going to solve the complete problem in one go, in one article. So that's when we can go and pull in others and say, here's what the future work is going to be. And say, now my next plan is to, say, build additional indices of access to healthcare barriers. And it might be for more specialized services. Are there specific things that prevent people from accessing behavioral health services, or drug treatment services, or mental health services, or occupational or physical therapy? So I can then be more specific and say, here's my next steps, here's my future work. That can also go into the conclusion. So to summarize, in this general framework of what are the parts of a typical quantitative analysis, quantitative spatial analysis manuscript. We start with an intro on what's important. Why am I doing this? The lit review, what have other people done to address or understand this problem? Data. What information do I have to bring to bear? What have I collected to bring to bear in better understanding this problem? Methods. How will I go and evaluate what I have, use the data I have to evaluate my problem? The results, okay, I carried out the methods. Now, what did they tell me? I take those results and I discuss them. I provide context. I interpret those results instead of just leaving a table here for the viewer to figure out. And lastly, concluding by revisiting the research questions, by making and driving home that case that, yes, I did indeed answer my research questions and I did indeed provide some important new information that the world had not seen before. So those are the parts of the paper and you'll have, for the paper for this course, intro and lit review will be combined, as will discussion and conclusion. You can present them as different sections if you wish, but there will be one assignment on each of those. So if you have any questions about this, you may feel free to email me. You can speak up during class and ask about this. In class, I gave everybody my text number, so you can use that as well. So have a good one. I'll see you at the next class.